Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Chapter 3 is research ethics, and Chapter 4 is research design, uh, working with measurements. So let's go ahead and get started. The first chapter, of course, Chapter 3, talks about ethics. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that is concerned with morality, what it means to behave morally, and how people can achieve that goal. It can also refer to a set of principles and practices that provide moral guidance in a particular field. There's ethics in everything: business, medicine, teaching, and of course, hopefully, scientific research. Many kinds of ethical issues can arise in scientific research, especially when it involves human participants. For this reason, it is useful to begin with a general framework for thinking through these issues. And of course, when you put together your own research proposal, this is one of the things that you have to think about, is the ethics of what you're doing and how you're going to do it. There's a framework for thinking through the ethical issues involved in psychological research. There are 4 general moral principles that apply to scientific research: weighing risks against benefits, acting responsibly and with integrity, seeking justice, and respecting people's rights and dignity. There are 3 groups of people that are affected by scientific research: the participants, the scientific community, and then society in general. The idea is that thorough consideration of ethics of any research project must take into account how each of the 4 moral principles applies to each of the 3 groups of people. Scientific research in psychology can be ethical only if its risks are outweighed by its benefits. Among the risks to research participants are that a treatment might fail to help, or even be harmful. A procedure might result in physical or psychological harm, and their right to privacy might be violated. Among the potential benefits are receiving a helpful treatment, learning about psychology, experiencing the satisfaction of contributing to the scientific knowledge, and receiving money or course credit for participating. And this is normally how research is done. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of college faculty do research. They do research on their own students, and they will give their students credit for participating in the research. Larger universities, of course. Oh, I don't know. Maybe someday Dene College will start doing psychological research, but I guess it's possible. Dr. Kine, the psychologist that was here prior to Dr. Russ and Dr. Barber and Dr. Begay, she was a cognitive psychologist, and she wanted to do research. As a matter of fact, she was in charge of the IRB. Now Dr. Russ is in charge of the IRB. A risk to society is that research results could be misunderstood or misapplied with harmful consequences, and this is not good. It is not necessarily easy to weigh the risks of research against its benefits, because the risks and benefits may not be directly comparable. It is common for the risks of a study to be primarily to the research participants, but the benefits primarily for science or society. In the Stanley Milgram's original study on obedience to authority, the participants were told that they were taking part in a study on the effects of punishment on learning. In reality, the punished participant was a Confederate who was not being shocked at all but faked his pain. The result of the study was that most of the real participants continued to administer the shocks right through the Confederates' protests, complaints, and screams. And let's just reiterate the Milgram experiment. This was done at Yale University. They brought 2 individuals in. One of them was the participant, and they were to shock the other participant if they missed a question. They were trying to show that punishment created stronger learning, was the idea. The reality is that the individual that was being shocked was a Confederate. They weren't being shocked at all. Were faking it. They were faking the pain. They protested, they complained, they screamed, and of course this is all taped. So each individual that was doing the shocking heard exactly the same thing. And oddly enough, and what they were trying to determine was why in the world were people really as obedient as the Nazis claimed that they were. The Nazis, of course, were torturing and murdering individuals that they thought were subhuman. Jewish people, gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities. They were torturing and murdering them, but the common people in Germany were the ones that were supporting this or were not complaining about it. And so the idea was, is obedience, human obedience that common? And what they determined was that about 65% of the individuals in the original study were obedient, and but they were all men. So they decided to do it on women, and what they discovered was that they got exactly the same statistic. That 65% of the women were willing to shock the individual beyond the protests, complaints, and screams. Although this is considered one of the most important results in psychology, with implications for understanding events like the Holocaust, of course, they weren't really testing learning, they were testing obedience. That's the whole point. They were using deception. Uh, they were trying to determine why this happens, and of course, events like the Holocaust or mistreatment of prisoners by U.S. soldiers at Abu Ghraib, it came to the cost of producing severe psychological stress in the research participants. And of course, that's one of the things that happened. If you read Milgram and read what he said about his experiment, people weren't that upset about it. The people that they were, who had been severely psychologically stressed by the research, they felt positive about the research. But of course, we talk about this all the time. This happened in 1963 before IRBs, so it was questionable. And there are other questionable research that has taken place. Zimbardo did a prison research back in the 70s at Stanford University that became very controversial. And these, of course, Milgram and Zimbardo are two of the iconic researchers that we will discuss. And I'll talk about Zimbardo later. Researchers must act responsibly and with integrity. This means carrying out their research in a thorough and competent manner, meeting their professional obligations, and being truthful. Acting with integrity is important because it promotes trust, which is an essential element of all effective human relationships. Participants must be able to trust their researchers are being honest with them, for example, about what the study involves, will keep their promises to maintain confidentiality, and will carry out their research in ways that maximize benefits and minimize risk. An important issue here is the use of deception. Some research questions, such as Milgram's, are difficult or impossible to answer without deceiving research participants. Thus, acting with integrity can conflict with doing research that advances scientific knowledge and benefits society. Researchers must conduct their research in a just manner. They should treat their participants fairly by giving them adequate compensation for their participation and making sure that benefits and risks are distributed across all participants. At a broader societal level, members of some groups have historically faced more than their fair share of the risks of scientific research, including people who are institutionalized, are disabled, or belong to racial or ethnic minorities. Researchers must respect people's rights and dignity as human beings. One element of this is respecting their autonomy, their right to make their own choices and to take their own actions free from coercion. Of fundamental importance here is the concept of informed consent. This means that researchers obtain and document people's agreement to participate in a study after having informed them of everything that might reasonably be expected to affect their decision. Another element of respecting people's rights and dignity is respecting their privacy, the right to decide what information about them is shared with others. This means that researchers must maintain confidentiality, which is essentially an agreement not to disclose participants' personal information without their consent or some appropriate legal authorization. Even more ideally, participants can maintain anonymity, which is when their name and other personally identifiable information is not collected at all. It may already be clear that ethical conflict in psychological research is unavoidable, because there is little, if any, psychological research that is completely risk-free. There will almost always be a conflict between risks and benefits. Research that is beneficial to one group, for example, the scientific community, excuse me, can be harmful to another, for example, the research participants, creating especially difficult trade-offs. We have also seen that being completely truthful with research participants can make it difficult or impossible to conduct scientifically valid studies on important questions. Although it may not be possible to eliminate ethical conflict completely, it is possible to deal with it in responsible and constructive ways. This means thoroughly and carefully thinking through the ethical issues that are raised, minimizing the risks, and weighing the risks against the benefits. It also means being able to explain one's ethical decisions to others, seeking feedback on them, and ultimately taking responsibility for them. Historically, human ethics have been encoded in religious teachings since the dawn of humanity. But too often, religious codes identified believers in one way and non-believers as denigrated others. But after the scientific depredations on others during World War II, a commission was put together to encode human ethics that rejected otherness. And if we look at the history of especially the history of Europe or the genocide that took place with indigenous peoples all around the world, one of the things we see is that people are elevating themselves above everyone else, and other people they are denigrating. And this even happened with Europeans against other Europeans. Of course, the nation states fought each other on a continual basis. Catholicism fought Protestantism. Catholicism fought any concept that was different from their teachings as a denigrated other. This is a picture of the Cathars in southern Europe. The Cathars had different ideas than the Catholic Church, and they were hunted down and burned at the stake because of their blasphemy. And this is just how it worked. It's part of European history, of course, not the best part of European history. And of course, you all know about how Europeans traveled the world telling people that they were denigrated others in one way or another, usually by killing them or enslaving them. And of course, this happens very rarely today, we can assume, but now, of course, in the scientific research, we have ethical codes. The first ethical code that was developed was the Nuremberg Code. It's a set of 10 principles written in 1947 in conjunction with the trials of the Nazi physicians accused of shockingly cruel research on concentration camp prisoners during World War II. It wasn't just done in Germany, of course. The Japanese did some god-awful research. I'm trying to think of it was a group called Group 247. They would, or something like that. It was a number anyway, and they would travel around in the the Japanese area of influence, and they would do these strange experiments. They tried not to do, they didn't really do them on the American prisoners or the British or Dutch prisoners that they took, but they did them with the individuals that were the Chinese, the Cambodians, the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, the people that they conquered. It provided a standard against which to compare the behavior of men on trial, many of whom were eventually convicted and either imprisoned or sentenced to death. The Nuremberg Code was particularly clear about the importance of carefully weighing risks against benefits and the need for informed consent. Now, curiously enough, I was stationed in Germany between 1979 and 1982. And because of some of the things that the Germans did during World War II, the Germans weren't allowed to use they weren't allowed to have any laboratory supplies that were from humans. In the United States, of course, we make different vaccines and whatnot that are based on human structure, the human cell structure. But the Germans weren't allowed to do this. So um, one of the things that we did in the laboratory was cross-match blood, and you cross-match blood by matching it with other blood types. And if it clots, it means that it's you've tried to put together two blood types that aren't going to mix very well. And but we had to send to the States to get that. So anything that had to do with human products, the Germans couldn't have because of what they did during World War II and some of the experiments that they did. And this is back in the 80s. So, and I'm not exactly sure if this is still part of the Nuremberg Code. It's part of the Nuremberg Code that nobody found out about. We're talking about the 10 principles. This is one of the sub principles that I'm talking about. The Declaration of Helsinki is a similar ethics code that was created by the World Medical Council in 1964. Among the standards that it added to the Nuremberg Code was that research with human participants should be based on a written protocol. A detailed description of the research that is reviewed by an independent committee. The Declaration of Helsinki has been revised several times, most recently in 2004. Now, you'll remember that Milgram did his experiment in 1963, and his experiment was one of the reasons that they made the Declaration of Helsinki. The whole concept of IRBs, and you need to write out the total protocol because, of course, Milgram's experiment did not have the same thing, did not have the same written out protocol. And there you go. In 1978, a set of federal guidelines called the Belmont Report recognized the principle of seeking justice, including the importance of conducting research in a way that distributes risks and benefits fairly across different groups at the societal level. It also recognized the importance of respect for persons, which acknowledges individuals' autonomy and protection for those with diminished autonomy, for example, prisoners and children, and translates to the need for informed consent. Finally, it recognized the principle of beneficence, which underscores the importance of maximizing the benefits of research while minimizing harms to participants and society. An important part of these regulations, we're talking about the Belmont Report of these regulations, is that universities, hospitals, and other institutions that receive support from the federal government must establish an institutional review board, a committee that is responsible for reviewing research protocols for potential ethical problems. An IRB must consist of at least 5 people with varying backgrounds, including members of different professions, scientists and non-scientists, men and women, and at least one person not otherwise affiliated with the institution. The IRB helps to make sure that the risks of the proposed research are minimized, the benefits outweigh the risks, the research is carried out in a fair manner, and the informed consent procedure is adequate. The federal regulations distinguish research that poses three levels of risk. Exempt research is the lowest level, or risk that includes research on the effectiveness of normal educational activities, the use of standard psychological measures and surveys of a non-sensitive nature that are administered in a way that maintains confidentiality, and research using existing data from public sources. It is called exempt because once approved, it is exempt from regular continuous review. Expedited research poses a somewhat higher risk than exempt, but still exposes participants to risks that are not greater than minimal risk, those encountered by healthy people in a daily life or during routine physical or psychological examinations. Expedited review is done by one member of the IRB or by a separate committee under the authority of the IRB that can only approve minimal risk research. Many departments of psychology have such separate committees. Greater than minimal risk research must be reviewed by the full board of IRB members. The APA's Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, also known as the APA Ethics Code, was first published in 1953 and has been revised several times since then, most recently in 2010. It includes about 150 specific ethical standards that psychologists and their students are expected to follow. Much of the APA Ethics Code concerns the clinical practice of psychology, advertising one's services, setting and collecting fees, having personal relationships with clients, and so on. Standards 8.02 to 8.05 are about informed consent. Informed consent means obtaining and documenting people's agreement to participate in a study, having informed them of everything that might reasonably be expected to affect their decision. This includes details of the procedure, the risks and benefits of the research, the fact that they have the right to decline to participate or to withdraw from the study, the consequences of doing so, and any legal limits to confidentiality. There are situations in which informed consent is not necessary. These include situations in which the research is not expected to cause any harm and the procedure is straightforward, or the study is conducted in the context of people's ordinary activities. If you wanted to sit outside a public building and observe whether people hold the door open for people behind them, if a college instructor wanted to compare two legitimate teaching methods across two sections of his research methods course, these would be not require informed consent. Deception of participants in psychological research can take a variety of forms: misinforming participants about the purpose of a study, using confederates, using phony equipment, and presenting participants with false feedback about their performance, for example, telling them that they did poorly on a test when they actually did well. Deception also includes not informing participants of the full design or true purpose of the research, even if they are not actively misinformed. The APA ethics allows deception when the benefit of the study outweigh the risks. Participants cannot reasonably be expected to be harmed. The research question cannot be answered without the use of deception, and participants are informed about the deception as soon as possible. This approach acknowledges that not all forms of deception are equally bad. It acknowledges that some scientifically and socially important research questions can be difficult or impossible to answer without deceiving participants. I'm watching him turn that ball into a big ball. Wow, that's amazing. Standard 8.08 is about debriefing. This is the process of informing research participants as soon as possible of the purpose of the study, revealing any deception, and correcting any other misconceptions they might have as a result of participating. Debriefing also involves minimizing harm that might have occurred. Standard 8.09 is about the humane treatment and care of non-human animal subjects. Although most contemporary research in psychology does not involve non-human animal subjects, a significant minority of it does, especially in the study of learning and conditioning, behavioral neuroscience, and the development of drug and surgical therapies for psychological disorders. And normally they use mice or rats. Sometimes they use pigeons, and as you can see, these are mutant rats, and we will see their red eyes in just, well, you can see them there. Anyway, they're special rats, bred for psychological research. The APA acknowledges that the benefits of research on non-human animals can outweigh the costs, in which case it is ethically acceptable. However, researchers must use alternative methods when they can. When they cannot, they must acquire and care for their subjects humanely and minimize the harm to them. Once upon a time, there was a lot of research on primates, so they were using rhesus monkeys. They have stopped all that research. There's very little research on chimpanzees because they're so close to humans, and hardly any there, and none on rhesus monkeys. It was really kind of interesting because um, there are places in the United States where they've taken all these potential research subjects that they bred to do research on, and they've released them into wild habitats. Um, it's the only place in North America where they actually have primates, because there were normally not indigenous primates in North America. As far, I guess, Central America has some primates. Yeah, they do, because I was in Guatemala, and we heard howler monkeys. So yeah, I guess they never came across the desert, the Mexican deserts. Anyway, not important. So we don't do that kind of research anymore. Interestingly, when I was teaching at Fort Belknap College, one of our partners was University of Montana, and University of Montana had a primate lab, which has since closed, of course. This was back in between 2001 and 2010. As a matter of fact, let's see, I was hired to teach at Fort Belknap on a grant by the University of Montana that dealt with mental health career. It was the Mental Health Career Opportunity Program, and they got a grant to support the tribal colleges, psychology teaching in the at the tribal colleges in Montana. There's 7 of them. And I was hired at Fort Belknap to teach psychology with the University of Montana. Anyway, that's not important. It was really kind of weird because, of course, if you wanted to do primate research, you could go to the University of Montana, but of course our students weren't really looking to do any primate research. And as a matter of fact, that was the head of the department was promoted that, despite the fact he knew that none of the tribal colleges would want to do primate research. And I thought it was a little odd that he was the head of the department, and he thought he thought like a chimpanzee. I mean, he acted like that was the essence of knowledge, is understanding chimpanzees. A little bizarre. And of course, we didn't teach anything that had anything to do with primate research. Psychopharmacology and biological science, or biological psych, and physiological psych. Anyway, social psych. Standards 8.10 to 8.15 are about scholarly integrity. These include the obvious points that researchers must not fabricate data or plagiarize, Plagiarism means using others' words or ideas without proper acknowledgement. Proper acknowledgement generally means indicating direct quotations with quotation marks and providing a citation to the source of any quotation or idea used. Self-plagiarism is also considered unethical and refers to publishing the same material more than once. In other words, researchers should not borrow prior phrasing from their other published works, just as students should not submit the same work to more than one class. The very first thing that you must do as a new researcher is to know and accept your ethical responsibilities. This means reading and understanding the relevant sections of the APA Ethics Code, distinguishing minimal risk from at-risk research, and knowing the specific policies and procedures of your institution, including how to prepare and submit a research protocol for institutional review board. If you are conducting research as a course requirement, there may be specific course standards, policies, and procedures. If any standard, policy, or procedure is unclear, or you are unsure what to do about an ethical issue that arises, you must seek clarification. You, as the researcher, must take responsibility for the ethics of the research that you are conducting. Hidden dangers: identify and minimize risks to participants. List all the risks, including risks of physical and psychological harm and violations of confidentiality. It is easy for researchers to see risks as less serious than participants do, or even to overlook them completely. Some risks might apply only to some participants. You should seek input from a variety of people, including your research collaborators, more experienced researchers, and even from non-researchers who might be better able to take the perspective of a participant. A way to reduce risks is to modify the research design. Another way to minimize risks is to use a pre-screening procedure to identify and eliminate participants who are at higher risk. A third way to minimize risks is to take active steps to maintain confidentiality. According to the APA Ethics Code, deception is ethically acceptable only if there is no way to answer your research question without it. It is considered acceptable to wait until debriefing before you reveal your research question, as long as you describe the procedure, risks, and benefits during the informed consent process. Once the risks of research have been identified and minimized, you need to weigh them against the benefits. This requires identifying all the benefits. Remember to consider benefits to the research participants, to science, and to society. If the research poses minimal risk, no more than in people's daily lives or routine physical or psychological examinations, then even a small benefit to participants' science or society is generally considered enough to justify it. After the research design is developed, creating informed consent and debriefing procedures is necessary. It must be decided whether informed consent is necessary according to the APA Standard 8.05. If informed consent is necessary, it must be decided how to recruit participants, giving them as much information about the study as possible. A script or set of talking points should be developed to explain the study to participants in simple, everyday language. An informed consent form should be created that covers all the points in Standard 8.02a that participants can read and sign after you have described the study to them. And that's the way it's normally done. That's the way I did it with my dissertation. The research I did for my dissertation, I just had them read an informed consent form and then sign it. And I kept that on file, of course. Debriefing is similar to informed consent, that you cannot necessarily expect participants to read and understand written debriefing forms. So it is best to write a script or set of talking points with the goal of being able to explain the study in simple, everyday language. During the debriefing, you should reveal the research question and full design of the study. The next step is to get institutional approval for research based on the specific policies and procedures at the institution or for the course. This generally requires writing a protocol that describes the purpose of the study, the research design and procedure, the risks and benefits, the steps taken to minimize risks, and the informed consent and debriefing procedures. The approval process is an opportunity to think through the ethics of the research, to consult with others who are likely to have more experience or different perspectives than a novice researcher. If the IRB has questions or concerns about the research, address them promptly and in good faith. This might even mean making further modifications to your research design and procedure before resubmitting your protocol. Concern with ethics should not end when your study receives institutional approval. It is important to stick to protocol or seek additional approval for anything other than a minor change. During the research, monitor participants for unanticipated reactions and seek feedback from them during debriefing. Maintain integrity through the publication process and beyond. Okay, there you go. That's ethics. So let's talk about the psychological measurement that we're going to be doing. Measurement is the assignment of scores to individuals so that the scores represent some characteristic of the individual. It is consistent with measurement in other sciences. Psychological measurement is often referred to as psychometrics. Measurement does not require any particular instruments or procedures. It requires a systematic procedure for assigning scores to individuals or objects, so that those scores represent the characteristic of interest. Many variables studied by psychologists are straightforward and simple to measure. These include your age, your height, your weight, and birth order. Other variables studied by psychologists, perhaps a majority, are not so straightforward or simple to measure. We cannot accurately assess people's level of intelligence by looking at them, and we certainly cannot put their self-esteem on a bathroom scale. These kinds of variables are called constructs and include personality traits, for example, extroversion, emotional states such as fear, attitudes such as toward taxes, and abilities such as athleticism. Psychological constructs cannot be observed directly. One reason is that they often represent tendencies to think, feel, or act in certain ways. Another reason psychological constructs cannot be observed directly is that they often involve internal processes. The conceptual definition of a psychological construct describes the behaviors and internal processes that make up the construct, along with how it relates to other variables. Many scientific constructs do not have counterparts in everyday language. Researchers are in the business of developing definitions that are more detailed and precise, and that more accurately describe the way that the world is than the informal definitions in the dictionary. They do this by proposing conceptual definitions, testing them empirically, and revising them as necessary. Research literature often includes different conceptual definitions of the same construct. An older conceptual definition may be replaced by a newer one that fits and works better. And we see this all the time in psychology. Different psychologists will use the same term for different things, or they will have a new definition of that concept using the same term that they used before. It drives you crazy. An operational definition is a definition of a variable in terms of precisely how it is to be measured. These measures generally fall into one of three broad categories. Self-report measures are those in which participants report on their own thoughts, feelings, and actions. Behavioral measures are those in which some other aspect of the participant's behavior is observed and recorded. This is an extremely broad category that includes the observation of people's behavior both in highly structured laboratory tasks and in more natural settings. Physiological measures are those that involve recordings and any of a wide variety of psychological processes, including heart rate and blood pressure, galvanic skin response, hormone levels, and electrical activity and blood flow in the brain. There are scales of measurement or levels of measurement corresponding to four types of information that can be communicated by a set of scores and the statistical procedures that can be used with the information. There are nominal levels, ordinal levels, interval levels, and ratio levels, and I'm going to explain that all right now. The nominal level of measurement is used for categorical variables and involves assigning scores that are category labels. Category labels communicate whether any two individuals are the same or different in terms of the variable being measured. The essential point about nominal scales is that they do not imply any ordering among the responses. Responses are merely categorized. Nominal scales thus embody the lowest level of measurement. The ordinal level of measurement involves assigning scores so that they represent the rank order of the individuals. Ranks communicate not only whether any two individuals are the same or different in terms of the variable being measured, but also whether one individual is higher or lower on that variable. The items in this scale are ordered. This is what distinguishes ordinal from nominal scales. Unlike nominal scales, ordinal scales allow comparisons of the degree to which two individuals rate the variable. And of course, when we're talking about peppers, you better know how hot your pepper is. Yesterday, I went to a Mongolian barbecue. Was it yesterday? Yeah, I went to a Mongolian barbecue, and they were rating their sauces as to how hot they were. I made the mistake of not reading the scale and got a hot one for my last plate of Oriental noodles. It was different. My mouth burned for several hours. Something that, and that would be an ordinal level. The interval level of measurement involves assigning scores using numerical scales in which intervals have the same interpretation throughout. Interval scales are not perfect. In particular, they do not have a true 0 point, even if one of the scale values happens to carry the name 0. In psychology, the intelligence quotient is often considered to be measured at the interval level. And of course, this absolute 0 is 459.4 degrees Fahrenheit, or 273.15 degrees Celsius. That's absolute 0, where there's atoms are no longer moving. The ratio level of measurement involves assigning scores in such a way that there is a true 0 point that represents the complete absence of the quantity. Height measured in meters and weight measured in kilograms are good examples. You can think of a ratio scale as the three earlier scales rolled up into one. Like a nominal scale, it provides a name or category for each object. The numbers serve as labels. Like an ordinal scale, the objects are ordered in terms of the ordering of the numbers. Like an interval scale, the same difference at two places on the scale has the same meaning. However, the same ratio at two places on the scale also carries the same meaning. Excuse me. Reliability refers to the consistency of a measure. Okay, you need to understand where my cough came from. I was bitten by an insect right on my jaw, on my jawline, and it's gotten into my carotid into my joint right here, and now it's causing my lungs to fill up with not to fill up, of course, that would be pneumonia, to produce mucus, and that's why I'm coughing, because this bug got me on the right below my ear. Anyway, so as soon as that bug bite goes away, then my cough will go away. But right now it's there. Psychologists consider three types of consistency: over time test, retest reliability, across items internal consistency, and across different researchers inter-rater reliability. When researchers measure a construct that they assume to be consistent across time, then the scores they obtain should also be consistent across time. Test-retest reliability is the extent to which this is actually the case. A measure that produces highly inconsistent scores over time cannot be a very good measure of a construct that is supposed to be consistent, and that's test-retest reliability. So if you give the test the first time to a group of individuals and they score one thing, and then you give the same test to another group at another time and you get very different results, that's not test-retest reliability, even though they're not the same people. Assessing test-retest reliability requires using the measure on a group of people at one time, using it again on the same group of people at a later time, and then looking at the test-retest correlation between the two sets of scores. Of course, normally you don't really do this. You only test people one time, but you can test different groups at different times. And you would put them on a scatter plot to determine what's going on. This is typically done by graphing the data in a scatter plot and computing the correlation coefficient. Remember correlation coefficient? Correlation coefficient compares things from +1 to -1. So it would put it on that kind of a scale, and then you throw it onto a scatter plot. In general, a test-retest correlation of plus 0.80 or greater is considered to indicate good reliability. And you can see these are different scatter plots. This is really good rate of reliability. This is pretty good, and these two are really bad. Okay. Another kind of reliability is internal consistency, which is the consistency of people's responses across the items on a multiple item measure. All the items on such measures are supposed to reflect the same underlying construct, so people's scores on those items should be correlated with each other. Internal consistency can only be assessed by collecting and analyzing data. One approach is to look at a split half correlation. This involves splitting the items into two sets, such as the first and second halves of the items or the even and odd numbered items. Then a score is computed for each set of items and the relationship between the two sets of scores is examined. And I could do this with my quizzes. For example, I could take all the odd numbers and see how many people got them right, and look at the even numbers and see how many people got them right, and compare the two to see if my tests have internal consistency. Perhaps the most common measure of internal consistency used by researchers in psychology is a statistic called Cronbach's alpha, the Greek letter alpha, of course. Conceptually, alpha is the mean of all possible split half correlations for a set of items. A value of plus 0.80 or greater is generally taken to indicate good internal consistency. This is really kind of curious because my son has a master's degree in mathematics, applied mathematics, and he teaches statistics. And I asked him, what was it, 3 summers ago, if he would teach statistics. If he would teach statistics for at Dene College, and he agreed to do it. I gave him the book, and he said, "I don't. None of this stuff makes any sense. This doesn't fit mathematics." And this is one of the reasons why you need to take Psych 213 instead of the math course. And I don't remember the statistics math course, because psychological statistics are very much different from everybody else. Why? Because psychology uses different measurements. And one of them, the main one that my son complained about, was Cronbach's alpha. He looked at the mathematics statistics that he had been teaching. He knew all the terms. He knew lots of different terms that I had no clue about. But he said one of them that he had never seen before was Cronbach's alpha. And of course, Cronbach's alpha is used constantly in psychology to determine if something has internal consistency. So, when we talk about statistics in psychology, one of the main terms that we use is Cronbach's alpha, and that has to do with internal consistency. It needs to be around 80%. Now, the interesting thing is I didn't do my own statistics for my dissertation research. I sent it to a group and paid them money to do my statistics for me. And when I first sent it out to them, they gave it to I don't know, one of their statisticians, and they didn't understand what Cronbach's alpha was. So they sent it back to me, and it didn't have any Cronbach's alpha. And I said I needed Cronbach's alpha. Sent it back to them, and finally they gave it to a psychological research statistician, and he figured out my Cronbach's alpha for me. As curious as that is, so Cronbach's alpha is specific to psychology or social science research. As weird as that is. So if you want to confuse a statistician, just mention Cronbach's alpha. And then when they say, I've never heard of that before, you go, you never heard of it? Well, this is commonly used in psychology. You must not know very much about statistics. Give them a hard time. I'm just kidding, don't do that. Many behavioral measures involve significant judgment on the part of an observer or a rater. The inter-rater reliability is the extent to which different observers are consistent in their judgments. Inter-rater reliability is often assessed using Cronbach's alpha when the judgments are quantitative, or an analogous statistic called Cohen's kappa, the Greek letter K, when they are categorical. And actually, I've never seen Cohen's kappa before. Most of the research you look at will have Cronbach's alpha. Okay. Validity is the extent to which the scores from a measure represent the variable they are intended to. When a measure has a good test-retest reliability and internal consistency, as determined by Cronbach's alpha, researchers should be more confident that the scores represent what they are supposed to. Discussions of validity usually divide it into several distinct types. Here we consider three basic kinds: face validity, content validity, and criterion validity. And this shows for construct validity, but we're not going to talk about that. Okay, so what did I just tell you? I just told you that when I did my dissertation, I didn't do my own statistics. But what I needed to do before I did my dissertation is determine what statistics I could use. Most psychologists are not mathematicians. If they were mathematicians, they would be math majors, and that's just the way it works. So a lot of psychologists, when they do their research, they find a statistician. That's why there's a whole list of authors. One of them is the statistician. They usually put him fairly close to the top because that gives them their answers to their research. But most psychologists aren't statisticians. But you do have to take statistics so that you understand statistics. And if you're a mathematician and you're a psychologist, then everybody wants to be your friend. Excuse me. Face validity is the extent to which a measurement method appears on its face to measure the construct of interest. Face validity can be assessed quantitatively. It is usually assessed informally. Face validity is at best a very weak kind of evidence that a measurement method is measuring what it is supposed to. One reason is that it is based on people's intuitions about human behavior, which are frequently wrong. It is also the case that many established measures in psychology work quite well despite lacking face validity. Content validity is the extent to which a measure covers the construct of interest. Like face validity, content validity is not usually assessed quantitatively. Instead, it is assessed by carefully checking the measurement method against the conceptual definition of the construct. Criterion validity is the extent to which people's scores on a measure are correlated with other variables known as criteria that one would expect them to be correlated with. A criterion can be any variable that one has reason to think should be correlated with the construct being measured, and there will usually be many of them. When the criterion is measured at the same time as the construct, the criterion validity is referred to as concurrent validity. However, when the criterion is measured at some point in the future, after the construct has been measured, it is referred to as predictive validity because scores at the measure have predicted a future outcome. There are 4 steps in measuring a psychological construct for a research project: conceptually defining the construct, operationally defining the construct, implementing the measure, and evaluating the measure. Having a clear and complete conceptual definition of a construct is a prerequisite for a good measurement. For one thing, it allows you to make sound decisions about exactly how to measure the construct. There is no substitute for reading the research literature on a construct and paying close attention to how others have defined it. Now, if you remember, I told you how the research I did for my dissertation. My research, the dependent variable was resilience, and I had a resilience measure. Now, how in the world did I find that? Well, we'll talk about how I found the resilience measure before. So I had to define resilience. Now, I could have defined it myself, made up my own definition, but instead of doing that, I found what everybody else was calling resilience. And the reason I did that is because when you're talking about psychologists argue a lot. They don't agree with each other. And one of the reasons they don't is because they're thinking of the same thing in different terms. So when you're creating a conceptual definition, what you need to do is use the definition that other people have used. And if you do that, then there's no argument. Okay, this is what resilience is, and I've used the same definition as Rogers and as Freud. I've used the same definition as all these other psychologists. So when a psychologist reads the word resilience, if I use the same definition, they don't have to. I don't have to explain what my definition is. I just say, um, resilience as indicated by Freud or Erickson or whatever, and they go, "Oh, okay, well, yeah, that's the same definition that I use." Once you have a conceptual definition of the construct you are interested in studying it, it is time to operate. That wasn't right. As you have a conceptual definition of the construct you are interested in, studying it is. I'm sorry. Let me read this over again. Once you have a conceptual definition of the construct you are interested in studying, comma, it is time to operationally define the construct. I left a comma out. I apologize. An operational definition is a definition of the variable in terms of precisely how it is to be measured. Since most variables are relatively abstract concepts that cannot be directly observed, such as stress, observation is at the heart of the scientific method, conceptual definitions must be transformed into something that can be directly observed and measured. And this is the trick. It's got to be something that you can measure. So when I was telling you about somebody's research proposal a couple summers ago, they were talking about the bad roads in Chin-Li. How in the world are you going to measure that? How bad is this road? On a scale of 1 to 10, would you say this is a 10? Well, one guy says it's a 10, and another guy says, that's not that bad. You can drive around the potholes. And he'd say, I'd call it a 7. And that's part of the problem. How in the world do you measure this stuff? Most variables can be operationally defined in many different ways. Operationally defining your variables of interest may involve using an existing measure or creating your own measure. Now, this is a trick. So you need to find the best way to do this, and the easiest way to do this is to find somebody else who has done exactly the same type of research, and they have defined it for you, and they have either developed a measurement or they use an older measurement that does exactly the same thing. That's the trick. It is usually a good idea to use an existing measure that has been used successfully in previous research. Why? Because you won't have to standardize it. You won't have to prove that it actually measures what it says it measures. Other psychologists have used it and they have said, hey, look, I was looking for stress and I found it with this stress measure. In my own case, I used a resilience measure that had been used all around the world, and it was a pretty good measurement. Um, it's really hard. Resilience. How in the world would you measure that? Well, this lady, and turns out this lady that lived in Montana had actually developed a measurement that she had developed working at a nursing home in Washington State. And she had given all of these older individuals this measurement, and she had standardized it using all of these individuals. And then it was tried out in Ohio, and then it was tried out in Pennsylvania, and then it was used in Florida. And all of these people had done these resilience using this resilience scale. Hey, I didn't want to make up a resilience scale because then I would have had to have proven that it actually measured resilience. But all these other people said it did, and I could take my scores and compare them to other people's scores and say, hey, look, my group is more or less resilient than all these other people. Among the advantages are that you save time and trouble of creating your own, and that's huge. There's already some evidence that the measure is valid, of course, because it's been used successfully. Your results can more easily be compared with and combined with previous results. If there are if there are already if there already exists a reliable and valid measure of a construct, other researchers might expect you to use it unless you have a good and clearly stated reason for not doing so. And of course, I did not. It worked. It said it worked. And so I was expected by the research community to use the same measurement. Now the other thing has to do with your IRB. You got to get all this stuff approved. So if you're using your own measurement, if you're creating your own, then you have to prove to the IRB that it actually measures what it says it measures. But if you're using somebody else's measurement and it has been used on the same group that you're using it on, and it has been used in other psychological research, then there's no reason why they could reject it. And that's what happened to me. I got tangled up in the IRB. The IRB at my institution said it was okay. Well, we won't go into that. Anyway, I was doing my research on the reservation, and I had to go through their IRB, and of course they wanted proof that it would measure what it said it measured. If you choose to use an existing measure, you may still have to choose among several alternatives. You might choose the most common one, the one with the best evidence of reliability and validity, the one that best measures a particular aspect of a construct that you are interested in, or even the one that would be easiest to use. When an existing measure was created primarily for use in scientific research, it is usually described in detail in a published research article and is free to use in your own research with a proper citation. Now, well, this whole free thing, yeah, and usually what you have to do is you have to write a letter to the people that publish the measurement, and they will allow you to use it. That's all you have to do. Got a little tricky for me, and I'll talk about that. Well, maybe. The American Psychological Association publishes a directory of unpublished experimental measures, and psych tests, which are extensive catalogs, collections of measures that have been used in previous research. And you need to use these if you possibly can. Many existing measures, especially those that have applications in clinical psychology, are proprietary. This means that a publisher owns the rights to them and that you would have to purchase them. And this is what you have to do. People create these things, and then people around the world are using their measurements, and they're getting, I don't know, whatever. They will allow you to use this if you pay them, $100 or whatever. These include many standard and intelligence tests, Beck's Depression Inventory, and the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. So you have to buy the MMPI. You have to buy Beck's Depression Inventory in order to use it in your research. And they will allow you to use it, because you have purchased it. Most new measures in psychology are really variations of existing measures, so you should still look at research literature for ideas if you're going to create your own measure. Perhaps you can modify an existing questionnaire, create a paper and pencil version of a measure that is normally computerized or vice versa, or adapt a measure that has traditionally been used for another purpose. When you create a new measure, you should strive for simplicity. You should create a set of clear instructions using simple language that you can present in writing or read aloud or both. Keep the measure as brief as possible, because people get tired of taking tests. It is always better for a measure to include multiple items rather than a single item, because a matter of content validity, multiple items are often required to cover a construct adequately. A matter of reliability, when several responses are summed or averaged, the effects of irrelevant factors tend to cancel each other out to produce more reliable scores. Multiple items must be structured in a way that allows them to be combined in a single overall score by summing or averaging. People can react in a variety of ways to being measured that reduce the reliability and validity of the scores. The whole point is that you're better off. You don't have to worry about standardizing the test. You don't have to worry about the fact that the order of the questions, because that's already been taken care of by other individuals. So finding a test that other people have used in the past, that's the best way to go, and rather than trying to create your own. Even though this guy's going, yeah, do it. Yeah, well, that's the problem. And like I said, this is really kind of curious, because if you put three psychologists into a room and talk about a topic, they will argue. And there will be three different, and they'll never come up with a solution. Psychologists like to argue, and they have their own concepts. And of course, there are different schools, psychology schools, cognitive psychologists, and I have a friend that's he's a former student actually. He's an IO psychologist. Really kind of interesting to talk to him. Yeah, developmental psychologist. Dr. Barber's a forensic psychologist. Dr. Russ is a educational psychologist. Um, Dr. Begay is a clinical psychologist, and I'm a general psychologist. So you get the four of us in a room, and we can't agree on anything. As odd as that may seem, no, actually we don't disagree that much. Yeah. Anyway. People can react in a variety of ways to being measured that reduce the reliability and validity of the scores. Some participants might engage in socially desirable responding, doing, or saying things because they think it is the socially appropriate thing to do. Research studies can have built-in demand characteristics, subtle cues that reveal how the researcher expects participants to behave. Finally, your own expectations can bias participants' behaviors in unintended ways. And of course, he's not writing on anything. Make the procedure as clear and brief as possible so that participants are not tempted to vent their frustrations on your results. Guarantee participants' anonymity and make clear to them that they are doing so, that you are doing so. Excuse me. Oh, sorry about that. If you are testing them in groups, be sure that they are seated far enough apart that they cannot see each other's responses. Informed consent requires telling participants what they will be doing. It does not require revealing your hypothesis or other information that might suggest to participants how you expect them to respond. You should standardize all interactions between researchers and participants by always reading the same set of instructions word for word. Oh no, what's she going to do? Oh no, she's taking tests in Japanese. Ah. You have a set of scores. You are in a position to evaluate it more thoroughly in terms of reliability and validity. In most research designs, participants are tested at only one time. They are tested at only one time. For a new measure, you might design a study specifically to assess its retest reliability by testing the same set of participants at 2 separate times. If your newly collected data casts doubt on the reliability or validity of your measure, you have to ask why. It could be that there is something wrong with your measure or how you administered it. It could be that there is something wrong with your conceptual definition. It could be that your experimental manipulation failed. In short, it is back to the drawing board to revise the measure, revise the conceptual definition, or try a new manipulation. Da 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 da. There we go. We're done. Okay, I'll talk to you guys next week. I don't remember what we're talking about next week. I've got it on this list, don't I? And the answer is supporting literature. No, that's not right. Wait a minute, I got it here somewhere. I got to see my desk. It's a mess. Next week is experimental research. Okay. All right. Talk to you next week.